Alright guys, oh, excuse me. Welcome back to AP Environmental Science. We are going to cover topics 4.2 today, and I figured out that using the webcam was just using way too much RAM on my computer, and if you don't know what that is, it's just essentially what the computer needs to kind of function because the school here does not give us the best computers. So no webcam for a little bit until I can use my laptop at home to record some of these. Okay. So we're going to be going over topic 4.2, human threats to biodiversity, and then you'll see in class that we're going to cover some of this stuff in class, but most of this will actually be done at home, and then your Unit 3 and Unit 4 test will be a take-home test over winter break. All right, so let's take a moment to look at this data set for a second. So this is showing us the decline in monitored wildlife populations around the world. So this index is measuring the abundance of about 34,000 populations across 5,000 native species relative to the year starting in 1970. And we have a general trend here that the populations that we are monitoring in the wild are declining. So this red line is giving us kind of a central estimate of what we assume. The upper estimate is a more kind of positive take, like, oh no, we're actually losing probably about this much, whereas the lower estimate is the, most amount that we are losing in ecosystems around the world. So we now know what biodiversity is. It's the variety of life found throughout the world, and we know how and why biodiversity is important for maintaining stable ecosystems, for providing medicine and food and aesthetics, and just the overall functionality of the world around us. And we do know that there are different ways to measure biodiversity, and what we're going to learn about today is how is this biodiversity declining, what is causing it, and what are some of the issues associated with it, and the potential solutions. So before we get into that, we have to kind of go over a few key terms and their definitions. Some of this is stuff that we just did not get to go over in biology because biology already has so much to go over. So there are a few different terms that we use to describe a species. A native species means it's originally from that part of the world, whereas an endemic species is found only in that part of the world. So for example, we have deer here in America. We have New Jersey white-tailed deer, and they're found all throughout, the East Coast. However, there are other species of deer found in other parts of the world. An endemic species is found only in that particular part of the world. So we have the Galapagos giant tortoise. It's only found on the Galapagos Islands. And the ruffed lemur, you might recognize this from the movie Madagascar. They are found only on the island of Madagascar. Last lesson in 4.1, we went over the difference between generalist and specialist species. Specialized species or specialist species tend to have a very narrow niche. They need to live in a certain type of environment. They have to have a certain type of food. Endemic species tend to be highly specialized and are more likely to go extinct when their environment is disturbed because they rely so much on the environment around them. Invasive species and exotic species are a little bit different. Invasive species, I know that has been gone over in biology. Invasive species are non-native or introduced species that spreads aggressively and causes harm to the environment, economy, or human health. And the reason why these invasive species spread so rapidly and cause so much harm is because they don't have a natural predator to prevent population growth. So we know about the predator-prey dynamic. We know that predators help control the population of a prey and vice versa. But when you're an invasive species and you're introduced through an area through a variety of ways, you might not have a natural predator to control your population. So this is actually a photo I took in a local park near my house. This is an invasive species of vines, and you can kind of see them twisting around here. And if you look kind of in the background, those aren't like tree branches and twigs. This is an invasive species of vines that literally strangles trees and sucks up its nutrients. It is totally taking over the park near my house, and it is a huge issue with impacting biodiversity. Trees provide so many ecosystem services, supporting services like oxygen, provisioning services like food and timber, and even cultural services like beauty and aesthetics. So when you introduce these species to an area, they can cause widespread harm, and that would be an invasive species. An exotic species, however, is also introduced or non-native, but it doesn't spread rapidly or cause harm. So exotic just means it's introduced and it's not necessarily as bad as an invasive species. So these are some other examples of invasive species. We know this is the spotted lanternfly, a huge issue here in New Jersey and all throughout America. This is kudzu. This is actually kind of like another vine species that is totally covering trees. And this is an issue because we know that trees need their leaves to be exposed to sunlight so they can do photosynthesis, but this invasive species is actually covering an entirety of a forest, meaning that they're the ones getting the sunlight to do photosynthesis, and the trees and plants underneath are not. This is another example of that invasive vine species that is literally wrapping itself around trees and strangling it. This is also, oh my gosh, this is the lionfish. My brain was escaping me. This is a lionfish, a very highly invasive species found in the Florida coast. So this image right here is showing us the number of threatened endemic mammal species. So again, endemic meaning only found in that part of the world. This is showing us how many species in an area are at risk or highly threatened, critically endangered, or vulnerable. The darker the red, the more species there are that are endangered, threatened, or vulnerable. So if we take a look here, unfortunately, a lot of our endangered and threatened species tend to be in the Pacific islands, right over here in Indonesia, Australia, Madagascar, Brazil, Mexico, and then some of these gray countries here, it's not that they don't, they might not necessarily have not that many, but it's just that they're not endemic. So again, this is only endemic mammal species only found in this part of the world. Every single country around the world, for the most part, has endangered or critically endangered species. This is only endemic ones, meaning that these species here are only found in that part of the world. This is also showing us the percentage of endangered species among different plant and animal groups. So we have, if we take a look here, each one of these is showing us different types of life. So conifers are trees that don't lose their leaves, birds, reptiles, fish, amphibians, and mammals. And if we take a look, amphibians tend to be the most endangered or have the highest percentage of species that are endangered because amphibians live both inland and on water, and their life cycle happens to be both inland and on water. So if both their habitats are being impacted, or even just one of their habitats is being impacted, you're going to see rates of decline. Okay, so what is causing a decline in biodiversity? One of those things is invasive species that we just went over. So invasive species directly act as predators, pathogens, or they outcompete native species for resources. So remember the competitive exclusion. Oh, hold on. No, sorry, Miss Sung is interrupting me. So as we just talked about, invasive species directly act as predators, pathogens, or outcompete native species for resources. Remember the competitive exclusion principle. This is where one species or one individual cannot two species or two individuals cannot occupy the same niche. One is going to be better than the other at obtaining and using ecological resources. The one that is better is going to survive, while the one that isn't as good is going to, potentially decrease in population and go extinct. So we talked about the competitive exclusion principle and resource partitioning in Unit 3. Those concepts are going to come up a lot throughout the school year. So how are invasive species introduced? There's purposeful planting. So that invasive vine species I talked about was purposely planted as an ornamental shrub or bush, and the seeds can spread. So you can purposely introduce invasive species, and unfortunately, back in the 60s and 70s, there wasn't a lot of research done on how ecosystems would be impacted by purposely planting non-native tree species. Unfortunately, when we're transporting goods from all over the world, insects and even seeds can get stuck in fruit containers and shipped all over the world, and when they're in the new place, they will be released and causing all sorts of harm. That is how the spotted lanternfly was introduced here into America. There's also intentional release of exotic pets, including fish, turtles, snakes, and other reptiles. This is more of a issue in the South, where it's still illegal to have some kind of exotic pets, but there's less regulation and a higher chance of being able to purchase exotic pets in the Florida coast. Habitat loss is when environments are intentionally being destroyed, either by human development, deforestation, which is the permanent removal of trees, climate change, sea level rise, etc. And we're going to talk a lot about land usage in our next unit. So habitat loss is the number one driver of species extinction, and that's because every single animal on Earth, even if you are a generalist species, is adapted to its environment. They have traits that allow them to survive and reproduce in their respective habitat. You take that habitat away, you're essentially causing them to become homeless, and they now have to go somewhere else where they might not be adapted to it. So this is an example of massive deforestation happening all over the world, but this is happening in Mount Rainier National Park in Washington State. So on the left-hand side, this is the native original forest. On the right-hand side, this is showing us after the forest after clear cutting, which is literally removing all of the trees or the majority of trees in an area. And this is going to, of course, remove habitats for a lot of species, particularly birds. Now, this is an example. Oh, I'm sorry, the font here kind of overlapped a bit when I edited these slides. So 150 years ago, 200 years ago, we had a much more or a larger variety of crops and natural native vegetable and fruit species that we have artificially selected and bred and domesticated to be what we like eating today. So for example, broccoli, cauliflower, corn, strawberries, apples, the native species that we had 200 years ago either do not exist today, or they are grown in very specialized farms around the world and are very expensive. So 6,000 species have been historically cultivated for food, but today only 9 species provide 2/3 of all crops consumed by humans, meaning that we've lost 75% of our crop diversity in the last 100 years. And this is a huge issue, and one of the most common examples of this talked about on the AP test is the Irish potato famine in the 1840s. So unfortunately, all of the Irish farmers planted only one particular species of a potato. And we'll talk again more about this in Unit 5, but this is something called monocropping, which is only planting one type of species. And when you do that, you are potentially going to be exposed to some associated risks, such as not being disease resistant. So when they planted this one type of potato in Ireland in the 1840s, they were unaware that by doing so, they were potentially causing a huge chance of disease spread, and that's unfortunately what happened. So in 1845, a fungus appeared that killed about half of the potato crop in all of Ireland, and it continued to kill the potato plants for another 7 years. So because of this, again, 1840s, we don't have modern medicine, we don't have grocery stores, we don't have sophisticated refrigeration or food preservation yet. About 1 million people died of starvation, and another 1 million people left Ireland, with many coming to the United States. And this became known as the Irish potato famine. So I do have ancestors. My mom is or was half Irish, and her great-grandfather left Ireland because of the Irish potato famine and came here to Brooklyn. So it's just a huge example used on the AP test regarding the dangers of monocropping and reducing your crop biodiversity. This is the Global Seed Bank in Svalbard, which is a huge seed bank in northern Norway, which is intentionally used to hold onto seeds from around the world. So we have thousands upon thousands of different types of seeds and crops and plants here. God forbid a disastrous event occurs. This should ideally and hopefully be safe. It is underground, where if we needed to access seeds and crops, we have them. This is habitat fragmentation. This is when habitats are intentionally or inadvertently broken or fragmented into smaller, more isolated sections due to human development, which includes roads, cities, buildings, and deforestation. So if we look here, we have an original forest where we have the interior habitat and an edge habitat. If we look at the interior habitat, we have certain kinds of species living there, and the edge habitat, we have different kinds of species living there. When you have some kind of fragmentation, such as a road like this one or a city being built, you're now isolating or separating or fragmenting these two habitats into smaller patches. And this can lead to a lot of other things, particularly in evolution, where species are no longer interacting, meaning that they're no longer interbreeding, which can result in different kinds of natural selection and evolution. But this is an issue because we are now potentially reducing a species' ability to repopulate because they can't interact with mates, or we're reducing their ability to obtain food. Competition will now be higher because they have a smaller environment, probably leading to species decline. Pollution is a big one and a common one that you guys are probably the most familiar with. Plastic, microplastic, and chemical pollution can all cause serious harm to aquatic and terrestrial life. There's the big drive, especially in New Jersey, for no plastic bags, no plastic straws, and we'll see later this year that yes, plastic pollution is incredibly pervasive and an issue, but it turns out that fishing gear and plastic fishing gear is actually the number one plastic pollutant in the world. So, this is actually the reality for a lot of our species all over the world, and it is just incredibly sad. So the top right picture is a beach or an area in India. These are East Asian elephants. Now, think of tragedy of the commons, the happy fishing lab, sustainability, over-exploitation, over-harvesting, which is uncontrolled, unregulated removal of species from their natural environment in a massive swarm. So this mass extraction of life is just not sustainable. When we look at how these species, especially our fish species, are removed from the environment. If you guys looked at that TikTok I posted a few weeks ago, and if you haven't done so, please go look at it. It shows how bottom trawling, which is when they take these humongous nets and drag them along the sea floor, just nothing can escape it. It's too fast, it's too quick, and unfortunately we get a ton of bycatch as well. And it doesn't just have to be over harvesting in terms of fish. Poachers, were and are very common, especially in the 60s and 70s and 80s. Elephants and rhinos were hunted for their tusks. And traditional pianos, the reason why they're called the ivory keys is because pianos, the white keys were made out of elephant ivory, and they were hunted because ivory is very expensive and it's considered a sign of wealth and luxury and royalty. These are all examples of extinct species that have either gone extinct directly due to poaching or hunting, or indirectly to human activities such as development. So what have we done and what can we do to protect our species and regulate our habitats? There are a few different acts that we have kind of created in the United States as well as throughout the world. I actually want you guys to research all of these and just jot down a few notes, but the two most important ones are the Endangered Species Act and the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. So after this, please take a moment to Google those two acts and write those down in your own words, what they are, what they're doing, and how they are working. If you have any questions or need any additional help, you can always come check in with me during advice or after school, and I will see you guys in class. Bye.